Hi, I wanted to do a quick video about the Weapon Dynamics Computer, which is an online application for estimating the performance of a sword or a similar type weapon. I'm not a weapons expert, so the information I found out there about it was kind of confusing. There is a great video from Medieval Review. If you want more information, I highly recommend watching that. The link is in the description, as well as a link to the application itself. But I want to do just a quick and dirty demonstration of it. So the first thing I did was I took a screen capture of the tool itself and printed it. The subject in question today is going to be this copy of Carlos V's sword, not the candy bar, but this is just an inexpensive wall hanger that my dad bought in 1967 for $8. So this is not something you would actually use against an armed opponent. However, the pommel does unscrew, so you can end him rightly. So the first thing I did before I even printed out my document here was give it a name. And for mass, I just put this on a kitchen scale. It came out to 1,419 grams. This is all metric, so beware of that. Hilt extremity, that is going to be the point here on the hilt. There are exceptions. I don't really understand the rules as to why this would not be 0, but for the most part, 0. Blade extremity, so I'm just going to measure from the end of the pommel to the end of the blade. That is a whopping 122 centimeters. Grip reference, this is basically where you're going to be handling the sword. If you're dealing with a larger sword like this, especially if you're wearing a gauntlet, gripping it with one hand over the cross guard. So we can consider the center of the cross guard the grip reference. Now for a shorter single-handed sword, you might want to hold it further back here. That's where your grip reference is going to be. That is 24 centimeters. Lever reference, it's my understanding that this is basically the pivot point about which the sword is swinging when you're actually using it. In a case like this, it's going to be right where the pommel meets the grip. For a single-handed sword, like my bronze sword that I got from Levatino, that's going to be a little bit higher. 5.7. Center of gravity is where the sword balances, so right about there. And to get a more precise measurement, I'm just going to rest this on a pen on a table and take a measurement up to that point. That is 45.2 centimeters. So hilt node and blade node is where it gets a little more complicated. This is talking about harmonic vibrations of the blade itself, and if you've played guitar or bass or the like, you probably know what I mean, but basically when you strike the blade, there are certain points at which it will vibrate more or less. The nodes are where it vibrates the least. Now, the easiest way I found to find the nodes is to find the center of gravity right about there. It doesn't have to be precise, and about halfway between there and the end of the pommel is where I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to strike the center of gravity. Okay. Right about there is where I saw the least amount of vibration, and I'm going to repeat the test holding the node. And when I tested my bronze sword, which is what I used first, I actually had to go completely by feel because the blade is so thick that the vibrations were too fast to see. And so I just kept striking the center of gravity and sliding my hand back and forth slightly until I felt the least amount of vibration. You can see it pivoting perfectly on my finger here, so I'm going to take a measurement from the pommel to that point. That is 87 centimeters. Now to find the hilt node, I'm going to do basically the same thing. I'm going to hold the blade node, strike at the center of gravity, and I'm going to look for the least amount of vibration. Yeah, I see it pivoting perfectly about the cross guard, so 24 centimeters in this case. Okay, here's where I differ a bit from the norm. It seems most guys are doing what's called a waggle test, where you hold the sword and swing it back and forth like this and look for a node in the movement. I did that initially with my Levatino bronze sword and found that the physical model that I input differed from the theoretical model that the graph generated. And I think that's because you're simply eyeballing where the node is in the movement. So I switched to the Pendulum Test, and that seems to be a lot more accurate. Now what you basically do there, in my case, I set up a makeshift work platform and allowed the sword to swing. Number of periods, that's the number of times that it returned back to its start position as it swung. That's 20 in my case. I counted the amount of time it took to swing 20 times. That's 32.9. The axis is the point about which the sword was swinging, which is the end of the crossguard in this case, which was 24.5 centimeters. So we can input all that and generate our graph. Now obviously I made a little bit of an error in my calculation, as you can see on the left hand side. That means I just need to go back and tidy up some of my measurements. As for what the graph actually means, I'm not going to get into too much of that here, but it basically gives you a comparison about how input energy translates to output movement. And from there, it's fairly self-explanatory. You can save it, you can print out your results, you can maintain your own list. So anyway, I hope this was helpful.